All right, all right, all right. Come on in, come on in, come on in, everybody. It is wonderful. I'm glad to be here with you another Monday. And you know what time it is, what we do at every Monday, 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. We get it going, we get it cracking. Of course, it's the ADOS news you can use. And I'm always going to bring your best. I'm never going to shortchange you, never cheat you out of anything. And I have one of the best tonight. We're talking about a tough subject, sensitive subject, especially in the ADOS community, a subject that we don't talk about as often as we should. There's a lot of stigma, a lot of shame attached to it, but we're gonna get into it. We're gonna talk about it tonight. And I have the doctor. The doctor's in the house, my good friend, and I appreciate you, Doc. You jumped on at the last minute when I called you, so much props to you. Let me just give you your props right now. He's a father, professor, Black masculinist, a scholar, a Black Gnostic. ADOS says that proudly. Artist, Afrofuturist. Doc, did I miss anything? I think I went to the site. I tried to get as much as I could.
Nah, you said it, man. I appreciate you inviting me on, brother.
But Doc, it's good to have you. Tell the audience a little bit even more about yourself. And as you come in, before you do that, you know what Facebook likes. You know what I like. That energy, that excitement, those hearts, those likes, those thumbs ups. Make sure you share this show as much as possible, because guess what? The more engagement you give it, the more Facebook likes it, and the more they're going to push it out to see everybody else, for everybody else to see it. So you are Black media. You are our distribution. We just create the content, but you push it out, and we certainly appreciate everything that you do. But Doc, tell the people a little bit about yourself before we get into this heavy topic.
Well, first and foremost, I want to apologize. I still haven't replaced my Black Panther poster with a Killmonger poster, so I'm still developing my little studio. So I apologize, but that's going to happen. I'm faculty at Fresno State, associate professor in Africana Studies. This is my 11th year there. I've been teaching for 20. Oh God, when you say it like that, I've been teaching for 20. So I'm here at Fresno State. And much of my work has to do with Black males. And as Sean mentioned, I developed the concept of Black masculinism. And what I try to do is really highlight the humanity of Black men against a tradition, especially in Western media, of problematizing our representation. So we just come across as animals. We're often not put in context, and our experiences are not taken into account. And I try to do that with my work. So I have that on my website. I have a blog that I run called newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com. And then, of course, with my social media work and my publications, the focus is on Black men. I also have a show that I do twice a month on YouTube. Also, it's done live on innerlightradio.com. It's called The Onyx Report. And I talk about issues that pertain to Black men.
Awesome, Doc. And on YouTube, your YouTube channel, where can they find you on YouTube?
Yeah, just put in Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, or you can put in the Onyx Report and go ahead and like that and hit the bell for notifications so you can get notified. I pretty much do a show 2 Wednesdays a month, every first and third Wednesday, and I will be transitioning to doing probably more weekly content once I get everything set up in here. So I'm in that process now.
All right. Shout out to Mr. Otis Tempted. I said Son and BJS, 2 of my favorite Black heroes, 2 Black men. That's what's up, sir. We appreciate that. Trey Lincoln.
Thank you.
Good evening, sir. Good evening. Mr. Brown, Mr. Marvis Brown, good evening. Keep those comments going. You know, we like them. And we're not going to take any more time. Let's just jump right into it, brother, because I got you here for a reason. I did not have you here just for us to be talking. We're going to talk about a serious subject tonight, and that's Black men, African-American boys and men are killing themselves, and no one seems to care. And Doc, you deal with this a lot in your study. So just give us kind of a big picture overview of what you're seeing.
Well, for the most part, I think as a country, what we've seen here is that Black male death has been taken as par for the course. It's the forgive the pun, the white noise in the background that people don't pay attention to. So it's somewhat taken for granted. And even in the academy, what we've grown comfortable with is talking about Blackness as a monolith, right? So we talk about Blackness unless we're talking about women and girls, then we have a separate category for that. But when you talk about black men and boys, usually you're accused of sexism on one level or another. So the conversation either has to stay black or deal with black women, and black women and girls become synonymous with gender. So much so that I've been teaching a black male class for the last decade almost. And, when you tell students there's a black gender class, the first thing they assume is it has to do with women and girls or LGBT, because males, men, and boys have not been associated with the very idea of gender. I have young men that don't even qualify black men as gendered in their minds, and that's not their fault. It's really the way we talk about masculinity. It's not considered gender, right? So, when I bring in those kind of discussions and I want to engage people in dialogue, it's usually something new that many of my students haven't come across. And in regard to the death of men and boys, I think, I put up a post not long ago where I dealt with some CDC data in regard to the top 10 leading causes of death in the black community. And I put it up in terms of women and men, because one of the theories that I put forth, one of the arguments that I put forth is that black men and women actually do live different qualities of life, as much as we don't want to talk about that. And of course, it comes with accusations of, that kind of argument being divisive. But the reality is the reality, and it's backed by much of the data. So this is just one way to look at some of that data. This the chart you put up, the 10 leading causes of death. This is for black males between 1999 and 2017. And if you look at the far right, under where it says all ages, you see the top 10 leading causes of death for black males, right? Heart disease tends to top the chart across race for most people, which is enlightening in and of itself. But here's what's interesting about some of this. It's only this year that black men actually outnumber black women in terms of heart disease. Usually that's a number that's higher for black women than black men. So just to put it in context, what you actually have happening in the last, I'd say 5 years since I've been, really looking at these charts and including them in my work, black men mostly die before the age of 54. That's what you tend to find. And black women after the age of 65 tend to die due to things that are somewhat age related, like cancer, heart disease. They tend to be things that impact them after 65. So black men die younger from a wider set of reasons and greater numbers. And then black women die after the age of 65 due to health issues. So it's heart disease, it's diabetes, things of that nature. But what we found this year is this is actually the first year where black men exceed the numbers of black women in regard to heart disease as well. So it's kind of all bad across the board. And then you see under that malignant neoplasms, cancer, unintentional injury, homicide is one of the top 10 causes of death for black men. It's number 5. So you can see that there in red. So some of the differences I try and pull out just to kind of not in any way to be divisive, but to point out two things. One, that there is a different quality of life between black men and women. And two, that our attempt to label things just as black obfuscates the necessary conversations we need to have about the specifics between black men and women, right? So, in terms of that, the black men tend to die in greater numbers to black women in terms of cancer, unintentional injury, cerebral vascular issues, diabetes, nephritis, chronic low respiratory disease, and HIV. What you'll find is that, the two things on black women's list that black men don't have in terms of the top 10 causes of death are influenza, pneumonia, and Alzheimer's. Those are the two things that black women are dying from in greater numbers, and it's on their top 10 list than black men, as far as it being on the top 10 list. But then the two things that black men have on their top 10 list that black women don't have is HIV and homicide. And that's most especially for men who are having sex with other men. We see the disease, the levels of HIV acquisition pretty high. There were a couple of years ago, it was even such that it was a rate of 1 out of 2 that were expected to die of HIV. So these are important because they reveal to us the differences in the quality of life between black men and black women. And you would think that would lead to more discussion. But my colleague and I, Dr. Tommy Curry, have been pushing for black male studies, and it's been an uphill road. We've been fighting against this argument that we really know all we need to about black men. There's really nothing else to talk about. We need to talk about black issues for the sake of solidarity, and we could just bury those differences under the rug. And we find, according to the data, that's a problematic argument. So Dr. Curry actually had to leave the United States to start a Black male studies program in Edinburgh because this really not something we could do here. As a matter of fact, in many instances, we've been barred from even being able to transfer to other universities because our work on Black males tends to be what others view as incendiary. Now, the other part of what I started in this discussion, I made a second post about suicide.
Yeah.
And I pointed out the differences between Black men and Black women, or I should say males and females, because it's across age, right? Between the rates of suicide. And what we found is, and it's on these very charts, you can look this up pretty easily. There are about between 1999 and 2017, there were 3,294 Black females that committed suicide. For Black males, that number was 23,295. So almost 20,000 to the number more in that same time period of men committing suicide, or males committing suicide. And as you can see in the chart where it's listed in green, the age range is from 10 to 44. That's the age range for suicide for Black males, most particularly between 15 and 34, right? What exactly is going on in the lives of Black males that's leading to such dramatic differences? Now, we know across race, males commit suicide at a greater rate than females. What we often don't pay attention to is that women actually, females actually attempt suicide in much higher numbers than males. I think if I remember correctly, it's like 3 times as high. But males complete suicide in much higher numbers, and that's across race. So what I'm pointing to here is not specific to just Black folk, but the reason I do qualify that it is that it is one in many different areas where there's a very different night and day life experience that we do not talk about. And one of the things that I push as part of the reason for this difference is that there, you know, in terms of manhood, especially in the Western world, but to some extent we could argue across the world, there is an expectation. Whether we're not talking about whether or not every man achieves it. That's not the point. There's an expectation, a social expectation that men be able to provide, protect, so on and so forth. Well, when you've been statistically barred from employment, when you've been structurally routed into incarceration, there's some tensions that come about from not being able to perform in society to the degree that we, socially expect men to be able to. And there's a lot of frustration that comes with that. I mean, statistically speaking, Black men are the only group of men that when you control for incarceration, make less than their women. There's no other group that really has that dynamic. So here in this country, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, you have a social expectation that you basically are able to live out life like a white man without the means and structural stability to do so. And what that does. So the tensions, the pressures, all of that, I think plays a significant role in areas like suicide, especially when you talk about a recession, or when you talk about even something like what we saw years ago in Louisiana in terms of the levees breaking and whatnot, the impact of the loss of wealth, the loss of property. You know what I mean? What we started to see is definitely high rates of suicide, particularly for Black men, in dynamics where families are looking to men to be able to provide in ways that they can't. Especially when, in terms of education and employment, the country you live in, it doesn't seek you out. As a matter of fact, if anything, they might prioritize the women in your community. So here you have a dynamic where more and more Black men will reach out to me and tell me they're dating women that make much more than they do, but at the same time expect them to, support them in some very strange ways. I just, had a brother contact me, tell me a woman he met was expecting him to buy her an $800,000 house. Simply because he was a man and that was supposed to be his job. But that's not a reality for many of us. And I don't have to tell your audience, ADOS, where we stand economically, right? As a community, we're flat. And that's by family and family income. We can look at those charts. But when we really begin to look at the lives of Black males, especially when you account for incarceration, it's a very different story. Very different story.
You know what, Doc? And one of the things that I really want to talk about is a little bit about the pressure and the stigma, because as Black men in our communities, I think a lot of what we're seeing in the suicide is not being able to reach out to another Black man, or not being able to talk about it and get that out. And so can you talk a little bit about the stigma and really just just how that plays in our community to kind of, allow us not to be able to even talk about a subject like this.
Yeah, I think much of the time men are socialized to achieve on an individual level, and this is across the board in many different instances. But I'll give an example in terms of education, actually this example does apply to Black women as well in terms of education. One of the things we found is that even in the early 90s, the data showed that Black students tended to function individually in the classroom, whereas other groups had become acculturated to studying in groups. So they would start the semester. Actually, the best students start by getting a tutor before the semester starts, right? And their approach to it is to get a tutor for the act of getting rid of them. In other words, you get the tutor before the class starts until you no longer need the tutor. Many of our students come in working by themselves. They get a tutor when they're failing 3/4 into the semester, and then they're playing catch up. Part of what I'm getting at here is we've been socialized to function individually, because that's the image of success. I think, in America in particular, but in the West, that's the image we get. But it belies the reality that the most successful groups function in groups. They don't function as individuals. They represent themselves in the media as succeeding as individuals, but they function as groups. For us, we take that in, we tend to believe it, and we function as individuals, but we're also individuals coming from lack, coming from structural failure, coming from a lack of wealth, a lack of means. And, so in terms of education, what that would mean is you have kids who are coming in, having had extra. I remember this even when I was a kid. You had kids that would go to school and come home. I was a latchkey kid. That was the term in the 80s, right? My sister and I were latchkey kids. So we would come home, do our homework, watch cartoons, maybe clean the kitchen, and we're good. My white counterparts and Asian counterparts and Jewish counterparts would not go home from school. They'd go to an after-school program, right? And it'd be a paid after-school program where they were being introduced. So I remember, there was even a point where the gifted programs would test you in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, right? And one of the tests I got a chance to see, they actually had questions in there, algebra questions. And that wasn't something you were introduced to in the classroom unless you had been a part of another program. So even in that context, having means, economic means, meant access for kids and, to be introduced to ideas that set them apart. So by the time you get to college, you can see the difference, right? You can see the difference in what you've even been introduced to. We don't even got to get to grades yet. Just were you even introduced to these ideas? And if you hadn't had a chance to even be introduced, let's say you got good grades, you went to a public school and you did fairly good all the way through. You're still competing with somebody who did well and was introduced to other ideas outside of the dynamic. So by the time you enter the classroom, you're in a different set of classes because this person is able to test on a different level and so on and so forth. So this whole dynamic of coming in as individuals versus functioning as a group plays out, which is why in my classes, I promote them studying in groups. I even promote them taking exams together because much of the time my students haven't gotten that at any point prior. They haven't gotten the support to study in a group since. When it comes back to your question about Black males, I do think that's a feature of it. We learn as men, right, that masculinity is defined based on individual success, individual demonstration of skill, so on and so forth. So much of the time, I think we tend to function like gunslingers, like lone gunslingers on the range. You know what I mean? And we're rewarded socially for being able to succeed well individually, even with attention from women. But we don't function as a group in many instances, and that can end up being highly problematic, along with putting undue stress on us about being able to produce as individuals despite generations of structural lack and the social pressure to succeed against the odds as individuals. So all of that adds up, and you'll notice on that chart between 15 to 34, the number one cause of death, leading cause of death, is homicide.
Right.
Well, much of that you're talking about, the environment. We're talking about drug dealing. We're talking about all these issues. And as much as we want to pathologize them, what we also have to recognize, and we saw this with the war on drugs, is these are economic issues, right? Yes. Drug dealing is an economic issue when there's a lack of opportunities. I mean, the 1970s, we saw massive deindustrialization. Well, what does that mean? That means that Black men lost their jobs. They lost factory jobs. They lost government jobs. They lost access to what was the only kind of stable income many of us had after the sharecropping era in the South. So many of us moved up north to take these jobs. We lost a good portion of them when in World War II, when white soldiers came back and reclaimed the positions we were replacing them in. But afterwards, many of us actually were able to have a blue collar lifestyle. Well, by the time you get to the 70s, that's gone. And that's the same time period where the war on drugs starts. And even Nixon's administration admitted to targeting what they call blacks and hippies. But it had a profound impact on the black community, going especially through the 1980s, where black cities like Oakland and Chicago and New York, it looked like a nuclear bomb hit us. And it did. You know, we just didn't call it crack, but it was the same thing. It was that's what dramatically hit us. So the homicides you're looking at are often environmentally motivated, based on economics, based on a lack of access to steady employment, and of course, poor quality education. And so, you know, that's what that number is. It's not just failure simply because we just can't help shooting each other. It's more than that. For many people, it was bread and butter. So those are the dynamics we're looking at, and that individual competition, as well as the social pressure to exceed as an individual, all of that plays a tremendous role in how, you know, these events unfold in the face of, you know, trying to meet the American definition of being a successful man.
Exactly. And what are some, as we kind of wrap this section up, I do want to talk about, and thank you, Doc, because that you really broke it down. I want to talk about maybe some signs that we as a community can look for in our young men and in our men, not just, I won't keep saying young men, in men, right? Some of the signs that we can look for, and what are some solutions as a community that we can come and kind of come and help each other with that?
When you say signs for what?
Well, depression, or, you know, suicidal thoughts, or just some things we need to be kind of aware of.
You know, that's a very good question, because, you know, we think on the surface of it that we get it. You know, somebody may be depressed, somebody may be upset, but part of the Lone Ranger gunslinger dynamic is to not show weakness. I mean, much of the time, what black men have been socialized to do is to what I call John Henry it, right? We just we kind of take it and we're trying to beat the machine. And even if you do, it's going to kill you, but don't nobody tell you that. So, you know, we try and take it and not try and show any kind of cracks in our experience. And part of the reason for that is you're socially punished and ostracized for doing so. I mean, even though it became popular in the 80s to hear people say we want to hear men cry, the reality is it's not socially rewarded for men to show vulnerability on a wide scale. So most of us, you know, we know not to show it. And what that usually results in is fairly high levels of stress, and stress can manifest physically in all kinds of ways. Matter of fact, many of the ways of which you see on the top 10 causes of death, most particularly heart disease, right? A lot of that can come about from stress, but that is the social pressure of being pushed to, even as a child. Like, one of the things you first hear as a young man, especially if you're raised in a single parent home, is that you're the man of the house. Whether that's, you know, something that you're actually treated as or not, hearing the statement alone begins to induct young men into a dynamic of being providers and protectors on par with really nobody else, at least in terms of social expectation. But what we don't recognize is the pressure and stress that comes with, and the degree to which not showing that weakness is part of the dynamic. So what we have to be able to do is actually, I posted this a couple weeks ago. I asked men on my social media, I said, how many of you have had somebody call you and ask you how you are without an underlying agenda? They weren't calling to get something out of you. They weren't calling to ask you for something. They just called to ask you how you were. And it was surprising how many men said nobody. Nobody. Right. And if anything, a good portion of them, if they did, it was another black male, which is great, you know, but for the most part, many of them couldn't identify. And I had many of them write me privately to say that this doesn't happen. I appreciate the question, but you're bringing up some things I never thought about, meaning I don't have any support. Right. And support is a huge factor in trying to combat depression and frustration. But a lot of that is not going to be easily seen. So you really have to have genuine conversations and build a relationship with somebody to where you can be trusted, so that dialogue can bring about some of those issues. But it's almost impossible not to have a response to the type of social pressure black males have. And so we see it kind of happening with the numbers, but for some reason we kind of dismiss it. And even in academia, like I pointed out, there's a bait and switch that happens to where we really aren't going to talk about how this pertains to Black males as a group. We're just going to say, well, suicide is a Black issue.
Yeah.
Not really. Not on the same level. And matter of fact, if you put up that other chart right next to it for a quick second, you can see the numbers are dramatically different for a lot of that. So, yeah. So in terms of that, I'd say, solutions. I urge Black men to actually build relationships with people who are supportive and can be trusted, and be able to dialogue about the issues that pertain to you, right? You can see the numbers there with homicide. You can see the numbers there with suicide. Very different realities. Different realities. And we have to be able to say that. We have to be able to say it because it's true. And from there, get Black males to actually have support. I'm an open advocate of therapy. I think that's something we definitely could benefit from, provided you find the right therapist. That's a whole discussion unto itself. But being able to say, yeah, these are issues that I'm grappling with, and I need support. Building supportive relationships, I think, is one of the biggest things that we need to do to combat some of this structural depression, if I can use that term.
Yeah. And I appreciate that, Doc. And as we wrap this up, I want to touch real quickly on the JP Morgan thing, because I think it kind of goes to what we talked about before we got on, that even as Black men achieve what they would consider being successful, right? Football player, I got the money, I did all the right things, still facing this type of racism, but we'll get to that. But I think one thing you said clearly, if we have a takeaway and somebody could take away something from this, is just check on. When I shared this story right here, one of the things that I said is just check on your boys, check on your men. And as you said, hey, that doesn't mean a lot. All it means is, hey, how you doing? Are you okay? Need anything? You good? And as men, we can do that. We should do that for each other. Hey, bro, you good? You all right? Just checking on each other. Just that check. No agenda. I don't want anything from you. We ain't got to have this hour-long conversation. I'm just saying, hey, are you good? You all right? Cool. So really, really quick, let me go and jump on this because we're about to wrap it up so we can get to Yvette Cardell. Hey, make sure that you jump on Breaking Brown tonight. Don't want to take you guys away from that. But so JP Morgan, they got caught on tape talking about, JP Morgan's racist practices exposed in bombshell secret. So it is pretty well known. Well, I don't know if he's well known. Ex-football player, thought he had everything done, thought he was had everything done all right, the way you're supposed to do it, right? Let's see, let me get here. This gentleman here, okay, came face with allegations of uniform national discrimination against Black financial advisors, which resulted in financial institutions agreeing to pay 6 current and former employees $19.5 million in a settlement. The agreement also included company establishing $4.5 million fund, anti-blah, blah, blah, blah. All that's really irrelevant. All that's just icing on the cake, because what happens is when these big institutions, when they make these little kind of token symbolism things, guess what? They made billions. And so this is just what they call the cost of doing business. And so as you read into the article, I'm not going to get into it too much, but this is a successful guy. He was able to get on recording an employee telling them, hey, it's because you're Black that you're not able to get into this exclusive. Now, so he can get to a regular account, but that exclusive account, he wasn't going to be able to get into. And what happens is we have a lot of people saying, well, money's green. So it doesn't matter if you're Black or white. If you have the green, you can get in the club. And so we see that that's not true, especially when it comes to our community. So, Doc, can you talk just a little bit, real briefly, about that dynamic of, hey, you know what? Money's green. Once you get to a certain level, you're going to be good. You're going to be one of the boys.
Well, I think it's already pretty clear, especially to your audience, that we come out of an experience that has been, structurally based in excluding us from being able to acquire wealth. I mean, at a time period where people were acquiring property, we were property. Those practices in many ways haven't ended. They're part of a long-standing tradition of excluding Black folk from being able to participate. Even when you follow all the rules, even when you do everything you were told to do, there's still structural ways that we're excluded. And that goes hand in hand with stereotypes, especially about Black men in terms of not being able to keep up intellectually, not being able to succeed, those kind of things. They dovetail with one another and reinforce each other in many ways, in terms of how many people, even in many instances, Black folk themselves, define our potential for success, our potential to be able to achieve, and so on and so forth. So this to me is just another example of a wide set of practices that weren't supposed to be put on record. I mean, you said that the brother actually recorded the phone call or whatnot. Right. How many different institutions across the country have we seen not be able to be recorded, but have the same kind of practices? This is not new, nor is it an isolated incident. And it's interesting to see the way Chase is handling it. I think at one point they said that we're going to create these different kind of funds to prevent litigation. Yes. Really, you just want to prevent this from setting fire the way it should, because what should happen is it should set fire and it should move across industries, right?
Yes.
We saw the debacle with education and some of the celebrities who were getting their kids into universities on these dubious grounds. That should have set fire across industries, because it's not limited to education, just like this isn't limited to Chase. But these institutions are fighting to prevent that, because what we're seeing with this incident with Chase is standard play. It's standard play across the board. And it's one of the contributing factors to why our wealth position is as low as it is.
And also why reparations is the only way. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep stay engaged, stay involved, do all that good stuff. But at the end of the day, it's reparations. As we come to a close, Doc, I appreciate you jumping on.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, man, I love it, brother. I love it, man. Brothers showing each other love, right? That's what it's about.
Yes,
reached out to my brother. He was just more than happy to get on with me, and I appreciate that, Doc. Any last thoughts, and where can the people find you at one more time?
Well, you can find me on Facebook, Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. You can find me on Twitter as Lord Hasan. You can find me on my website, which the brother had up a moment ago, www.thasanjohnson.com. And from there, I have a couple of different blogs you can look at. So I'm readily, accessible. I really do post a lot on these issues, but especially issues pertaining to Black males. So I'm hoping to get as many people involved as possible. So, look me up and engage in the dialogue.
All right, Doc. Well, I appreciate you. Of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, I appreciate that. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button, that like button, that share button. We want to make sure we get this out as much as possible. And I appreciate the Doc 2019. And I promise you, in 2020, I will have them on more often. With that being said, my friend, my brother, I appreciate you. Make sure you jump in, watch Yvette. I'll be over there. I'll be in the comments and chopping it up with you. Peace, family. I love you. Y'all have a wonderful evening. See you later. Goodbye.